All right, welcome. We're ready to get started. My name is Rebecca Lemon, and I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities here at USC. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about David Albertson's book, The Geometry of Christian Contemplation, Measure Without Measure, which was just published by Oxford University Press in 2025. We do invite those of you who are able to please turn on your cameras. It's a little bit of a nicer occasion if we can see the faces of colleagues and friends, if that's possible. Thank you all. Joining us today are two commentators, Amy Hollywood, who is the Elizabeth H. Monrad Professor of Christian Studies at Harvard University, and Alexis Torrance, who is Haydn Family College Associate Professor of Byzantine History at the University of Notre Dame. And the conversation will be moderated by our colleague Arjun Nair, who is an assistant professor of religion here at USC. Today's conversation was organized in partnership with the School of Religion and the School of Philosophy, so we thank them both. And I'll just talk through for a moment our program. The program today will start with a very short introduction to the book by David himself. He will then be in conversation with Professors Hollywood and Torrance for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. At that time, Professor Nair will open the floor to questions from everyone. You will be able to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand. And for those of you who are a little out of practice with Zoom, you could just kind of wave your hands wildly and somebody will pay attention. One thing that I've noticed in convening these 11 book chats is that over the course of a really captivating conversation between the author and the two guest interlocutors, the audience can take a kind of quite passive role because it's so fascinating to listen. So I encourage you to begin to kind of fight that sense of ease by formulating questions when you hear David, Amy, and Alexis converse so that you're ready when Arjun opens up the floor to all of us. David, many congratulations again on your wonderful book. Please tell us about it.
Thank you. Thank you to Rebecca and to Arjun for chairing, and of course to Alexis and Amy for taking time to be here. It's good to see so many friends and colleagues and students here. I'm going to jump right in, and I just have a few slides to kind of walk through the very bird's eye view argument of the book and kind of what material it covers, in case this is new to some folks, which I imagine it is for most. Can we see those slides okay? Okay. So in the book, I was really motivated to write it after working in mystical theology and studies in mysticism in Christian traditions before modernity, to focus on, to answer this question I have, which was, why do we find it so much easier and why is it so much more appealing in some ways to work on apophatic traditions? And do we even really have a good rationale of what cataphatic traditions are? So just to define those, that apophatic mystical traditions are those that are the via negativa, or a way of negation or saying what the divine or God is not, and has a long tradition going up through lots of medieval figures like Maimonides and Aquinas, or cataphatic mystical theological traditions, which really do the opposite and say what God is, or God but whether we're predicating, whether we're talking about images. The more I thought about it, the more I wasn't sure we had a really robust definition as historians about what the cataphatic was and what its distinctive value and kind of rationale was in the economy of those two ways of speaking and the text that we're recovering. And so my gambit in the book, my strategy, is to look at the way that those ancient mystical sources in Christianity are thinking about God out in the world, not only in the interior of the self. That is to say, in what ways do these texts, as long as they're also talking about experiences of God, are talking about things like points and lines and shapes, diagram, proportion, magnitude, depth, curves, points, etc. In other words, in a sort of capacious sense, not working geometry as a mathematical discipline per se after the 17th century, but something more like the original sense of a world measure. So how are there coefficients of world measuring going on inside mystical texts? And is that a clue to what's distinctive and of value in cataphatic mystical texts, which are often, but not always, written by women in Christian traditions. So to get at this, I try to expose that there's really not one governing theological aesthetic or framework for approaching these sources, but actually two. And the problem that, as I analyze it, is that there's been an overemphasis on just one of them as if it's the only one in the world, when in fact there are two different traditions. So the burden of the book is to try to identify the difference between what I call tradition A and B, and then really to spend most of my time showing what's distinctive in particular about tradition A in Plotinus, the great third century Neoplatonist Greek philosopher, and then bringing out tradition B as it's a kind of has its own distinctive internal rationality, so we can familiarize ourselves with how it works. In tradition A, the apophatic comes first, the cataphatic is secondary. In tradition B, you also have the two coordinated, but the cataphatic comes first, the positive, and the apophatic is included, but has its sort of different role. So in the book, I go through the following authors in different chapters, and I first focus on Plotinus, who I just mentioned, and then I work through three sets of Christian authors. Plotinus is a highly influential, maybe the most influential Greek philosopher in Christian traditions, but not himself Christian. And then these other three are different sorts of, as it usually happens, monastic authors, in fact, in different periods in the first millennium. So in tradition A, I try to analyze what is distinctive about Plotinus's approach. That he has a certain suspicion of geometrical figures as things that need to be negated last or most of all before you can perceive the divine one, as he calls it. But he also has sort of three rules that construct his idea of a formless absolute. And if you work in later literature or later intellectual history, and you're thinking of German Romanticism and the formless absolute, I think there is a kind of through line from Plotinian philosophy to those ideas. So originally in Plotinus, the one cannot be also a logos. The one must be in control of itself, must not be conditioned by another, even to give it a gift. The one must be autarkic, he says. And the one is forbidden from desiring. We can desire the one, but the one does not desire the world. In tradition B, things are different. And I was kind of surprised in my research to find, and I've tried to, construct and represent in the book, the way that the overturning of each of those moments happens in successive centuries of Christian appropriations of Plotinus. And it happens simultaneously with authors who are more enthusiastic about geometrical figures as a kind of mirror or even a kind of icon of the divine form. And so these three overturnings, the one can desire, the one pours itself out, kenosis, rather than being autarkic, guarding its unity, and the one being also a logos, are explained, are evident in each of these sources. So Pseudo-Dionysius talks about the way that the one does have eros, famously. These two monastic authors from the Byzantine controversy, John and Theodore, talk about the way the one pours itself out in kenosis into the structures of magnitude. So you have medieval, early Byzantine monks talking about math and geometry to a way that surprised me, but there it is in the text on the page. And then you have these 12th century authors reading Boethius, commenting about how the one is logos, and what they mean by that is they say the one is a square. The verbum, the word, the divine word is a square or is an angle. So just to sum up, I hope these are some of the takeaways of the book to help us to historicize this unmarked Plotinian aesthetic that's suspicious of figures in the world, that leads to an emphasis on the apophatic, and to demonstrate that it's not the only aesthetic, that there is a tradition A, but there's also a tradition B, and that as historians we can kind of use both as frameworks for recovering these intriguing sources. Second, I hope that it improves our retrieval of mystical texts by women visionaries who are often in cataphatic traditions. Not always. There are also apophatic women mystical theologians, to be sure. But for women who are participating in visionary traditions and seeing images and having somatic experiences, it's often in a cataphatic register. And so I think it's valuable to have that tool in our toolkit as historians to make sense of what they're doing and why it's important, and not just that they failed to negate. And finally, I hope that it helps us in a very short conclusion that I suggest can maybe help us have a new perspective on our own very technologized and hypermetric experience of the world, and to make sense of that is not only something that kind of puts us into a situation of negation, but also has possibly this kind of iconic possibility hidden within the geometry that we live inside today. So I will stop there, and I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say.
That's terrific. So, Amy, do you want to start?
Sure. We were asked to be brief and just have a couple sentences about the book. That's not my strong suit, but I will try. And David laid out the two traditions that are crucial to the book. I guess one way I would describe the book as is it's way too rich. There's way too much stuff to actually talk about, even scratch the surface of what's in the book. But in the study of Christian mysticism, we've had a tendency, in a 19th century German tendency, to talk about affective versus speculative that has not gone away. Ongoing attempt to think in terms of cataphatic versus apophatic, which has not gone away, and that it plays a role in David's own characterization. I think what the novelty and what's fascinating about what's David's done is to say, let's think about it not in terms of apophasis and cataphasis, but in terms of the image of God as formless, or God as a perfect form, which, as he just said, and one of the questions I have about that I'll come back to is, for me, one of my biggest, things I'm trying to impress on people is that you can never have apophasis without cataphasis. The apophatic is always the unsaying of something that has been said, and it's the lifting of the boundaries of that thing that has been said. So given that for me, apophasis and cataphasis always have to be entwined, I wonder how and if that plays a role in David's conception of the formless God, is the tradition that sees God as formless versus the tradition that sees God as perfect form. The one other thing I just wanted to say descriptively, though, that I think is really important is David's account of why we've become so obsessed with the apophatic for its own sake, which I just don't think is a thing, but people are still trying to talk about it. And the argument is, in the introduction, that I think is really brilliant, is that in a world, post-17th century world, in which everything seems to be calculable, read in terms of, broadly speaking, mathematical conceptions, and mathematization, and the mathematization of the world seems to be part of the so-called disenchantment of the world around us, that people have, studying mysticism, have turned to a God that is beyond measure and a soul or an inner being that is incapable of measurement as the places that can somehow stay safe from modernity's technocratic, mathematizing imagination. I think that is a novel and an important insight about why the obsession with apophasis. That leads me to a series of questions that I'll get to, but those are the things that seem most important to me in terms of what the book as a whole is doing, and the importance of what the book as a whole is doing. Alexis, did you want to do your?
Sure, thank you, Amy. Also, I'll just do a couple sentences as well, and then pass the baton back over for some big picture questioning from Amy. It's a brilliant and beautifully written book. So thank you so much, David. Every second page seems to have some quotable line. So I urge you all, just for the sake of the beauty of the prose, to pick it up. And in it, David issues an urgent clarion call for all of us to rediscover. Even he makes the argument for us to reappropriate the mystical tradition of cataphasis, or at least putting cataphasis first, or affirmation first, in the face of the dominance and even hegemony of apophasis or negation. what he calls the ethic of perpetual negation at one point. Um, and he does this with a lot of care, a lot of diligence, the skill of a historian, but also of a good thinker. He walks us through what we could call the rise of the absolutization of apophasis or negation in Plotinus. And Plotinus's understanding of the formlessness of the one. And one of the key contributions of this book is it's a bold one. You'll probably get a decent amount of pushback from the perennial Neoplatonists out there, which I think he calls them that at some point as well. But he says that actually this is undermined repeatedly by Christian Neoplatonist writers, supremely Dionysius himself. That Dionysius and later the Byzantine defenders of icons in the 8th and 9th centuries, without eschewing, without renouncing the achievements of apophaticism as such, nevertheless radically undermine the tradition by the tradition of Plotinus, that is, with this strong and abiding cataphaticism. Again, like Amy, I have some questions, more on points of specific argumentation, which we'll get to. But it's a great achievement, beautiful work. Let me hand it back over to Amy for the question, though, and then I'll get involved.
Okay, thanks, Alexis. I think my main question, or my main, I agree with everything that Alexis just said, in terms of the praise and the ambition of what the book is doing. I think my worry, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just gonna say my worry, and that is my worry is that, as I said, we've been through the sort of affective versus speculative. The cataphatic versus the apophatic, doing that the opposite way. Adding another tradition A, tradition B that has this twofold dualist kind of distinction between the formless and the perfect form. And in particular, associating women predominantly with one side of that. It just makes me worry that again the complexity of the interactions of men and women thinking with thick, robust images and sounds about God, and then disrupting them in a variety of ways. I think there's a lot of unsaying of the image that happens in a lot of the women mystics that you named, David. And especially since you end the book by saying, where we are is measure without measure, that there is a way in which the apophatic is always going to come, not as a negation, I don't think every negation is apophatic, but as a refusal of the boundaries around our conceptions of what the good, of what the beautiful, of what the form might be. I'm worried about that getting lost. And I guess one of the ways I would ask a question, rather than just sort of saying what I think, is to ask you when you turn, and this is not work you do in the book, but when you're going to turn to, or when you turn to more visionary kinds of figures, and there are moments of this in the book. And I think in the 12th century people you look at, you can see an explicit tie to geometry. But is your sense that that will be true going forward? And is the geometrical geometry, as broadly as you construe it in this early modern way, itself marked by a kind of abstraction that is not going to necessarily be able to get at the profoundly bodily and visual and sonic aspects of the visionary mystical traditions in which you're interested in. So I guess the one way to ask the question is, what's the relationship between the claims that God can desire, God is kenotic, God is logos, and the specific issue of geometry that you've made so central, and so brilliantly so central to the book as a whole? Does that make sense, David?
Yes, thank you for that. Maybe can I respond to that one next, Arjun, if that sounds good, and then we can go back to it before I forget all those good questions that Amy posed. Um, uh, Let me say a few things. So the apophatic and cataphatic, I agree, are always intertwined. And that's one of the reasons why I was motivated to write, because I don't see that in our scholarship as a community, that an acknowledgement of that precisely. And so it's sort of, it's a bit of a correction to want to heuristically emphasize that what I'm trying to do is heuristically emphasize one of those, not in order to separate, but precisely in order to better integrate the two, because they haven't been well integrated. But I agree, of course. I
Yeah.
do note that it's rare that it goes in the opposite direction. So we often say that the positive and negative belong together. You always have an affirmation, and then you have a negation. And then the moment of moving from the negation back to a new, wondrous, startling, surprising, appealing affirmation is sometimes sort of,
Yeah.
it seems like it always goes in one direction. So that was one sort of bigger picture motivation for me. Yeah, and then to address your other concerns, um, I just mentioned once or twice the kind of link between cataphatic mysticism and then the fact that many of them, those authors in later periods, which I don't treat in the book, as you know, are
Yeah.
women, and that
Without
I hope to
question.
do so next, which is true. I mean, it might be another 10 years, so you have to all tune in then. But for those texts, it doesn't, I don't think it follows that they need to all be talking about geometry or that they need to abstract away from the body. For
Okay.
example, John of Damascus and Theodore the Studite in those chapters, they're defending
Yeah.
the validity of colorful, vivid icons.
Yeah.
And Theodore is using Euclidean geometrical language in order to emphasize the reality and the kind of, he uses the term, the density of the body of Jesus. So those are not in distinction from each other, I think. So that
Yeah.
might be a kind of uh, uh, maybe something I would guess at. I need to look at the sources again, but to predict or to hope that we're not turning away from those or requiring the women mystics to be geometers in some way. And it's certainly the case that it's not only women who are affirmative, cataphatic, and men who are apophatic by no means. Most signally, as you know more than everyone, in the case of Marguerite Porete, who died in the early 14th century. But I think it's the case that in any of these authors, you have both moments, and there's
Yeah.
ways to deploy images, maybe in Julian of Norwich, which have an apophatic force to it. And so those things are always intertwined kind of at the granular level in the sources. My concern is we don't see that intertwining because of our parallax, in the 20th, early 21st centuries, where the negative is always a cause for wonder, for philosophical appropriation, for renewed investment in, projects as we choose what to retrieve and what to lift out and what to pass over or what to consider done. So I think part of the book is to make a claim for that in the future and to make a certain argument about geometry toward that end, but without, I hope, kind of constricting what those treatments will be
Yeah.
if the cataphatic were kind of unleashed. It's not that then it's always about geometry. I think that's a vestige in a way of Plotinus's particular configuration to
Mm.
articulate a formlessness of the one, that he has some certain, commitments and axioms. And it was those that I tried to examine as how they're overturned in the subsequent centuries. But maybe that's a good place to pause and we can continue the conversation. But I
Yeah. That's
think it's
great.
Alexis's turn.
Um, yes, thank you. Thank you both. Uh, th- th- One pulling a strand that was mentioned, the tradition A, tradition B, um, it always opens itself to um, a pushback. Can everything be squeezed into one or the other of these? Granted, one, you make it clear in the book that it's not cataphatic versus apophatic. In each of them, they're intertwined, but they're configured differently. One prioritizes one, the other prioritizes the other. And yet, it's still um, maybe doesn't quite capture all of what's going on in Christian mystical traditions. One example is in your interlude on size, you discuss the anthropomorphist movement, and you call it a second early Christian framework for contemplation, in which God has always had a body. So of which the incarnation is, exemplary, but nonetheless, it's a body, but too distant or titanically large to perceive. That's how you put it. And that approach has been revived under the banner usually of ostensibly Second Temple or intertestamental vision, or a Semitic versus a Hellenic approach to God. But where would that fit? So there seems to be an unresolved tension between this God is a body always, and this tradition A and tradition B. It clearly wouldn't fit in tradition A. But would it also, I'm not sure how neatly it would fit into tradition B either, because the anthropomorphist approach, okay, it might have apophaticism in the sense that the body's so big that you can't, conceive of it. But in theory, you could, presumably. So is that really apophaticism then? Where would you categorize that kind of movement that is not just early, it's kind of has this revival these days? Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, you preempted my response, which was I was going to say the moment of negation in those anthropomorphite Christologies is the inability to measure the size of the divine body. But I think it's intriguing how they begin with a kind of very concrete inscription of God's permanent presence in dimensions in the world. For those who haven't gotten to those chapters or are unfamiliar with it, this is like, a series of sometimes numerological passages that try to calculate, the width of one divine toe or something like that, because God's body has always been massive and present in the world, but just it's so large, it's effectively in occultation, and that the Christian notion of the incarnation is a manifestation of the pre-existent divine body in the body of Jesus. So that's I think a kind of good example of a participation of one body within another, of one measure within another, the large and the small, the Christ body and the cosmic divine body, which goes from positivity to positivity, but still contains within it that ratio of difference that marks out an unmeasurable measure. So even in the most kind of graphically, cataphatic, God has always had 10 fingers and 10 toes since the beginning of time, and it's been part of the world's measures. Even in that situation, there still is a role for negation. And so it might mean a kind of, I'm hoping tradition A and tradition B, and I try to say this several times, but I've had this question several times. So maybe I should have said tendency A and tendency B, that they're less useful as kind of categories or buckets to put certain people in one category, certain in the others, but just to identify the complexity of the ways that the negative and positive are folded together, or the complexity of even, in an instance of, startling positive measures of the size of the divine hand or the divine elbow, that even then there's a role for the negative, that measure and inscription in the world and negation before the 17th century, just to speak very crudely, they're not in tension. So there can be an inscription that's positive in a world measure, and then there can also be a negation alongside it. And those are not in tension. I think sort of back of the envelope, after the 17th century, those things are in tension. And so the experience of God retreats into, as Amy was saying from the intro chapter, the experience of God retreats into the immeasurable self, and that immeasurable self makes contact with an immeasurable God. And then the world is the domain of measure, which is therefore secular, profane, and handed over to the sciences. And that's that sort of situation that we inhabit since the 17th, 18th century, is the world we live in. And so this is not a matter of sort of truth or falsehood of that model, but I think we can be aware of it as historians and try to attend to the ways in which that world in which we live in might be shaping what we're capable of hearing on our first pass from these first millennium sources who don't live in that world and for whom inscription in the world of the cataphatic, like in the anthropomorphite example, means that they could also think epiphatically, right next to it. But I've definitely heard the feedback from the perennialists and the Neoplatonists and the defenders of Plotinus and so forth. So that might be more controversy to come. We'll see.
I have more questions, but I also am conscious of the time, and if Amy also wants to ask something, so
No, go ahead, Alexis. I had one more question, but you ask another, and then we'll open up.
okay, thank you. So it's something just out of curiosity I'd like to hear more about. So you argue Dionysius and the Byzantine defenders of images, they pinpoint, of course, the Incarnation as the locus for underwriting kind of an inescapable cataphaticism. Because now, by taking on humanity, the divine has become permanently measurable, circumscribable, depictable in some sense. But it's not a straightforward sense. There's still a lot of negotiating and qualifications that have to take place. And there's also the purpose of it. So if we take Maximus the Confessor, who's in between Dionysius and the defenders of images, but a commentator of Dionysius, when he reads something from Dionysius about God transcending himself by becoming incarnate, he says that the Son of God elevated nature to himself, making nature itself, and thus the qualities of nature, like measure, another mystery. That's the word he uses. He makes nature itself another mystery. In other words, now that, yes, we can talk about measuring God, but it's a mysterious kind of activity. The point of the Incarnation, in other words, isn't simply to ratify measurability, to ratify geometry, to ratify the line, but to make us who are measurable in that way somehow immeasurable, to clothe what's corrupt with incorruption, to use Pauline language, or to restate the classic formulation about God becoming human to make human gods. God becomes measurable in order to make us immeasurable in some sense. Can you talk about this? It really is the question of deification in Christian mystical texts. Um, our form, not just that God takes on our form, and then now we can talk in terms of our form, and it's talking about God, but in order to make our form somehow divine.
It's a great question. I have to confess, there are a couple authors who don't appear in the book because I'm not sure what to do with them. And others have pointed this out to me. One is Augustine, which I'm well aware of. I think the book took an extra 3 years to write because I was stubbornly trying to hold on to Augustine in the narrative. And, so maybe Augustine's important because he doesn't fit in either category very well. Another one is John Scotus Eriugena, and then certainly Maximus is probably another case of that, where they're doing something so complex with so many sources from so many different sectors of antiquity that that needs like additional treatment, instead of these sort of spot archaeological digs that I try to do in the book. I think if there's an answer to that question, I don't know of it in the sources I looked at. But to think along with that question, I would shift to the possibilities for vision, because I think what the iconophiles, John and Theodore, are doing, it's not just sort of about the object of vision, the object of the icon. And as you say very well, it's certainly not the case. They think that the purpose of the Incarnation was to sort of rewrite our aesthetic capacities as painters and so forth for icons, but for things out there. But they do talk about differences in seeing and different capacities for visualization if the line can direct vision to God instead of concealing God, or if the world can become iconic in some way, or the measures that we use in the world don't block a perception of divine presence, but actually through a geometrical inscription operate as a kind of icon itself. So not just in a literal icon with the Christ face, but that the measures in the cosmos could become iconological in a sense. I think that's just a step past what Theodore states but implies, and that's what I try to kind of on his behalf outline in the last few pages of what that might feel like to say that into with 21st century language in the conclusion. I haven't written this yet, and I've fastidiously kept his name, out of the book. But there is a figure who thinks about measure as an icon itself, and that's Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century, where it's the geometrical per se, not even just the icon, but geometrical measurement as an early modern scientific enterprise, which takes on iconological contemplative significance, right? And the process of measuring is a way to see God, he says. So that would be a kind of further direction. Yeah, but I'll probably leave that part there because that's outside.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
gonna
Over to you, Amy, I think.
I'm gonna step in just very quickly because we Rebecca has indicated that we're ready to open up the floor to audience questions, but not only one question has come in so far. Well, actually, now we have two. So maybe we should move. Is that okay, Amy, if we move to those questions?
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, all right. So we have the first question by uh, which is in the chat. I can just read it for you, David, or you can read it yourself, maybe,
Um,
whatever you prefer.
sure. If you could read it, then I can listen.
Sure. All right. Yeah, that's better, right? Yeah. How can geometry be applied to the very cataphatic liturgical experience, psalmody, music, processions, etc., that constitute a large proportion of the daily experience of all Christian mystics? And I'll keep a cue for everybody else.
Great question, Father Luke. I think I would maybe just backpedal for a moment to say if there, were more scholarship in this direction, we could pivot from just the geometrical to the quadrivium, which includes both arithmetic and geometry and harmonics, as you know. So it could be that that's a form of measurement which is not about magnitude in the usual fourfold depiction of the ancient mathematical sciences. It's not number, not magnitude, but rather proportionate magnitude, which is to say rhythm and liturgical harmonies and so forth. So that would be another moment of measure that could be recovered. I don't do that in the book, but I think that would open up another great field of research in the same direction of trying to recover what are structures of measure in first century contemplation that we might miss as actually engaging the world and not just being a matter of interior experience.
Next, we have Rachel. Could you unmute yourself yes, go ahead, ask your question, please.
Hi, David. It's
Hello,
good
Rachel.
you know where I'm going to go. Okay. I haven't read the book except for the first line, which is a language dies when no one remembers how to speak it. Hurrah. So I can say I'm looking forward to reading it, and therefore my question comes out of the negative space if I haven't read it yet. With two kind of linked questions, and I'm wondering where to go with it. Where are the diagrams? Because you promised a book in geometry and I
Mm-hmm.
looked through and wanted diagrams.
Mm-hmm.
And two, the one thing I did think to look up is you have at 144, 145, a brief discussion of the Shirokuma, the measurement of the body traditions. And I became very interested in those a few years ago because it occurred to me in reading one translation or one description of those measurement traditions, they look like what we call the Majestas in all early Christian art, right? It's the image of Christ in majesty, and then you put it as the Hellenized Judaism and the sort of background to our Christian traditions. Is there a stronger claim to make that the sense of the early Christian art is actually participating in this measurement of the body meditation? So my two questions: where are the diagrams, and
Hmm.
two, how does this it becomes the Kabbalah, but how does this measurement tradition sit behind, in fact, our representation of Christ,
Hmm.
majesty?
Yeah, some of that interlude chapter on the Shir Koma is also about in the scholarship that I was learning in the book between those traditions and the Christological hymn in Philippians 2. So that is one
Mm.
instance where there is like a point of contact, as you're pointing out. About the diagrams in the book, yeah, I contemplated that. I didn't really have any diagrams to share, to be honest. But in a lot of these texts, it's in the folds of the text, and it's in the words, and it's in the intimations that they're and the vocabulary that they're using. I mean, I sort of animate this in the beginning of the chapter on John and Theodore. I was a little worried going in, like, if I'm right, then this would mean that monks in the seventh and eighth century are talking about geometry. That can't be right. That can't be right. And then lo and behold, you open up the page and they are, right? So some of the things it's about not necessarily seeing a visual trace in a visual medium that we might have diagrams to reproduce. There is that too, but also trying to inhabit their own imagination about the world. There is a great book coming out by Jeffrey Hamburger on the importance of diagrams in the commentarial tradition on Pseudo-Dionysius, that it's almost like there's an impulse to get out of the lines of text and into the space of the graphic diagram in order to do Dionysius justice. And so for the older reading of Dionysius, where it's all about negation and invisibility exclusively, that would come as a great surprise, that you needed the visual to comment on Dionysius adequately. But thank you.
Edward, your question? Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Hi, David. Thank you so much
Hi,
for
Eddie.
your wonderful book, which I'm really enjoying, and it seems very important. I think particularly about contemplation and how you articulate the sort of stages and the cataphatic side of contemplation. And I'm just wondering though, for I think still today, and I'm teaching in a seminary context, people doing liturgy and Bible reading and so on. The apophatic comes as, or in the tradition, comes as a bit of a surprise, and a sort of, for many of them, I think a delightful surprise that there is
Hmm.
this study of space and the need to make space among the sort of coordinates that they have, for God to be the object rather than assumed in as having been pinned down. Um, and it in that sense, it seems to me there is a sort of priority for the negative, that the negative, if you like, raises the discourse from something that could go badly wrong to something that is
Hmm.
open, something that is open to God.
Hmm.
And I wonder whether, that this sort of view of what, say, Dionysius is doing, thinking particularly of Dionysius, but there is a priority for the negative. So I just wanted to ask you about that,
Hmm.
without the negative, it all goes badly wrong. It would be how I would
Hmm.
describe Dionysius's sort of main point.
Hmm.
Do you think that's inadequate? Do you think that's not a priority, a statement of priority?
Yeah, the scholarship of Dionysius has been, deepening and developing away from a view, I think, as I was learning the literature, especially the one looking at his context more carefully, that it's not sort of a one-way direction from the positive to the negative in
Mm.
all cases. For example, the idea of hierarchy as a premise of the apophatic, a hierarchy which is an inscription of structure and order by God kind of permanently as a kind of thumbprint of God in the cosmos, for example. But to your broader point about maybe if I can just pivot for a moment, I'll try to keep these brief, but about different readers of Christian tradition, different speakers in Christian tradition. I tried to attend to that briefly, and I think this is maybe some of Amy's concerns, not to want to pivot, not to want to pigeonhole certain speakers in certain categories. I'm trying to do actually the opposite. I mean, to be blunt, I have aunts and uncles, and they're all cataphatic theologians to a person, right? I mean, they're sort of so this is sort of like an ordinary Christian speech, and I think there is something of a problem we've gotten ourselves into where there is an elite apophaticism and mundane or ordinary naive speech that's cataphatic. And I'm precisely trying to undo that by asking the elites to esteem the cataphatic and to ask themselves, do they have a good account of its own richness, its own wonder, its own sort of sensibilities to it? Not to put anyone in one category or the other, but to try to work against some of those unfortunate, late medieval kind of literary discursive structures that we enter into, where the philosophers are quite good at the apophatic, and it's something that they use to display their own, discursive authority. And then the ordinary folk are still stuck with the cataphatic, a bit benighted, So there are patterns of that still persist today that I'm trying to fight against.
Thank you. Yeah.
As timekeeper, I'm a bit I'm wary of measuring time, which I think might be connected to the divine left hand, right? Not the right hand. Although in Islamic sources, both of God's hands are right. But I'm wondering, Rebecca, do we have time? Do we have about 10 minutes left, or can we go over the hour mark? Because we have a lot of questions.
Zach,
maybe.
I don't know if Zach, who is really my co-organizer, has an opinion, but we certainly have 10 minutes. And
all right.
Because it's Zoom, of course, people, if they need to leave, can, but the conversation is free to unfold in a little more dilated fashion. That's helpful.
All right. Wonderful. So try to keep your questions short, but you don't necessarily have to if they're really good questions. Okay. So Michael, next.
Thank you, David. Really nice to see you, and thank you for your really wonderful book. I wondered if you could reflect slightly on very explicitly hyperbolic claims in a lot of mystical texts around space. So you have, Bernard, when he talks about annihilation, says it's as if the soul is annihilated. Angela says it's as if the soul is in the midst of the Trinity. Even Marguerite at times says it appears that the soul wills the will of God. And are there times when these spatial imageries are used, or spatial imageries are used, where the writers are very explicitly saying it's not really these spatial images, it's something like this? And does that impact the way that we approach those texts?
That's a great question. I've come to think about mystical texts as a kind of non-quantitative, but nonetheless spatial enterprise. That a lot of them are proposing a kind of alternative mapping of the world, or an experience of constructing an alternative spatiality, different senses of distance and proximity, ascent and descent, interior and exterior. It quickly becomes a kind of geometrical vocabulary, one that's not subject to quantity, but which is a kind of non-quantitative spatiality. And maybe that's a good avenue toward getting to the place where we can talk about the cataphatic as a sophisticated project of spatial projection and mapping, and a kind of, to use Michel de Certeau's word, a kind of alternative topology. And that's what the mystical is. It's all about immediacy and distance and so forth. Those are all spatial terms about intervals and contact and touch. So when we have those cases, there are some moments where a spatial model is developed as a poetic metaphor, and then there is, I think, a gap between whether it is like a moment of mathesis, or whether it's a moment of poiesis, and whether it belongs to the number or to the word. So there can be a construction of a spatial image which is used poetically in the domain of word. I'm more interested in, and we could look at maybe earlier cases, because those are, in our world, the 12th century is late. But in some of the earlier cases, I think there are moments where those constructed spaces are meant in a bit more of a realistic sense, not as a poetic expression of an interior, unmeasurable experience, but as a kind of place to reside. So, for example, and just to contradict what I just said, Hildegard of Bingen, another 12th century author, when she's describing these concentric spaces of the egg or the womb or the cosmos or the wheel, does she mean those as poetic expressions of an interior experience? I know those weren't your words, but does she mean it in that way, or does she mean it as some sort of more cosmic level construction of an alternative place? So it's something that kind of cuts against our categories. Those are the ones I'm most interested in, but I absolutely agree with you that there are lots of places where, I think there's a good book on the way that Bernard of Clairvaux kind of wanders laterally through his memory caverns in pulling together texts, and he has his own kind of topology that he works out at the level of text. I hope that responds.
Alex next.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I mean, I haven't read the book, and I now look forward to it even more. So I've learned a lot already about it, and I just had a question that's kind of a maybe less of a deep and more of a historical question, that gets to the Neoplatonists in your, or rather the one Neoplatonist you mentioned, Plotinus, and I was wondering, of course, about others like Proclus and Iamblichus in particular, who are sort of big in the elite
Hmm.
in culture later on, right? So
Right.
reading these things, and I'm just wondering, particularly, I mean, if you think of Proclus, with who, of course, very nicely also has a commentary on Euclid.
Mm.
So I'm just wondering, how do these figures fit in particular, the I guess the way you framed in the schematic narrative of like Christian versus these sort of early
Yes.
Platonists, does that complicate things? Do we have a sort of more complicated reception of that past? Or
Yes.
yeah.
That's a great question. I do talk a little bit about Iamblichus and Proclus in the introduction to Dionysius in that chapter. And I take them as interesting because they mark a kind of Greek non-Christian Neoplatonism, which didn't need to be anti-geometrical. So in a way, it kind of shows the increasingly peculiar particularism of Plotinus as my bête noire in the book. And, Proclus embraces the geometrical, and he has these beautiful passages on the way that schemata belong to the divine figures. And he has a whole theory, as you know, of, projecting the imagination into the realm of the geometrical, or rather that the imagination is the realm of the geometric. It's our geometrical field in our mind that corresponds to the world and so forth. And I think it's very important that Dionysius is very close to Proclus and not so close to Plotinus. But the sort of 20th century reading of Dionysius is he's effectively Plotinian, which I think is false. Why? Because he's, first of all, historically closer to Proclus, who's an enthusiast of geometry. And second, it helps us to understand, the gap between Plotinus and Dionysius, because it didn't need to be that way, so to speak. I mean, the Plotinus is really a peculiar case, but one that has such a massive effect in our intuitions, even unarticulated, about the formless absolute and the one without form. But to get at why he's strange, the Proclus case is quite hopeful. So that's in the chapter.
Great, thank you.
Amy, your
Amy,
question.
Hey David, thanks so much.
hello.
I haven't read the book, but I hope to get to it. My question is about some of the claims that you've made about modernity and how this has shifted, maybe how our ability to read certain things in mystical texts. Kind of as a meta question, it seems to me sometimes that the way geometry and space is thought of pre modernity is like already kind of imbued with a kind of mystical sensibility that in part of the shift to modernity is just having a different attitude about how geometry, mathematics like relate to the real world and how we think about space is just so fundamentally different there seems to me to be like a way in which modern people think about space and mapping as a procedure is fundamentally different to fundamentally different from the way pre-modern people think about it and how it relates to the real. So like I guess this is part of like the question I'm trying to work my way around. There's like the modern ability to think about geometries and mathematics as like abstracting from the real, controlling the real, making the real something that is manipulable, experimental. Like this seems to create a very different imaginary, just like what it means to think about the relationship between like geometries and the bodily material stuff that we live in.
Hmm.
And so this just seems like a different like sensibility about what
Hmm.
is my question making sense? I'm kind of thinking
Yes,
really.
yes. So the view that you're articulating that we have a kind of in to be modern means we have an immediate sense life experience of our immediate apprehension in our sense world and our life world. But then that's sort of on one side of the chasm, and on the other side we have an increasingly quantified apprehension of the world, and that this is instituting a kind of divorce between our two experiences of science and of meaning, of science and philosophy or religion. That narrative is very powerful, and certainly there's some truth to it. It's engineered by Edmund Husserl in the late 1920s in his lectures on the crisis of the European sciences, and then Heidegger's Critique of Technology picks up on that. So I'll make this brief, but in my first book, I talk about that problem, and I try to examine. I don't really get into the truth of that narrative per se, but at least some interesting counter instances of Christians also using mathematical measurement precisely as a way to sustain, like you were saying, the mystery of the world or the closeness of God to the world. In other words, part of Husserl's narrative is that mathematization of the cosmos is de facto secularization of the cosmos.
Mm.
And I think there are really important counterexamples to that in the 15th and 12th century, and that's what the previous book about. So in this book, I didn't sort of rehearse all that, but that is an important starting point that you're identifying, that this is sort of a second book in an ongoing project to think about how is mathematization not necessarily a secularizing force. And in the first book, it was like, Latin sources that are instances of that. And then this book was an opportunity to go back at the beginning of what we call mysticism or contemplation and see how that was really not the case. But to do that, I was hoping to just do a kind of quick foray into the Greek sources. But once I read Plotinus, it was like, uh-oh, we have a problem here. So then that occasioned a delay and a detour, from which I now hope to escape and never talk about him again.
Thank you. Thank you. Very
Thank you, Amy.
helpful.
That was a good question.
Jason?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm always so enriched by your books, David, and yeah, I thought it was a beautiful book. And much of it is way beyond my knowledge, but one place we do share an interest is, unsurprisingly, drag it into political philosophy and your account of secularization. Um, and I was actually sort of interested because you kind of preceded me in what you were saying about elite apophatic versus kind of popular cataphatic. And I was just curious if you have something to tell us about popular religion, because I guess I have a question. I had a question after you're reading your book, which is to what degree has secularization really had to do with the apophatic, given that popular religion is still experienced often as cataphatic? And just to give like insanely briefly a couple examples, like devotional practices by people, or you mentioned your uncles, and or everything from being in front of like the Virgin Mary or something like that to in a candle to nationalist deployments of, where there doesn't seem to be a proper apophatic negation of God is not like the nation or not really exactly your nation at all. I'm wondering if you have a different story to tell us about secularity there, because it sounded to me sometimes like the apophatic had been made dominant within secularity, and yet a lot of the mobilizations are highly sort of personified and cataphatic in political theology?
Good, difficult question, my friend. I think it might be that there are divisions in the ways that religious communities speak that we are still living and thinking within. I mean, one of my kind of motivations was imagining a counter present in which when you go to AAR, the American Academy of Religion, and you're looking at books on mysticism and you're going down the aisle and imagine that every other book was absolutely fascinated and finding philosophically rich dialogue partners on cataphatic mysticism, when sometimes it's quite the opposite with the apophatic, at least in our small little sub guild. That's the case. But if you go in the other direction and you can make, have political concerns about expressions of immediate experiences or positive speech that can't be negated. If there's a kind of robust cataphaticism, does that mean that you can't point out what Christian traditions would call idolatrous political speech that identifies one local material instantiation of a vision of the divine as the divine itself without negation? So what are the capacities for maintaining the wisdom of that negative distance while not turning it into a sort of antinomy or a binary where you're always demeaning the elementary and benighted cataphatic on the other side? And so I think the question is, are we sort of stuck inside that? And then what are strategies for trying to undo that? I don't know to be honest, if there are any kind of useful lines from histories of mysticism to being politically useful immediately to ward off, for example, nationalisms and other, like errors of the overly affirmative, if we want to put it that way. But I think more modestly, I hope the book can help us at least retrieve an archive which could be of use. Retrieve a three-dimensional, colorful, complex archive that could be of use in a future situation. I mean, that's maybe a modest first step that I would point to as an indicator of the book, so that in the future we make sure that at least we're not sifting through this millennium of Christian mysticism and just ending up with things that look like our own self-portrait in the 20th century, fascinated with the absolute formlessness of the divine one and the way that negation is never ending and all of that. I mean, that would be a tragedy. But on a more hopeful note, it still astonishes me, especially when I'm describing it to students and just saying it out loud. These are sources that we didn't have until the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. The revolution in the self-conception, even of Christianity itself, of what it is, the revolution continues, right, in 2026, in a complete overhaul of thinking about who are the authors, how did they write, what kind of texts, who are the brilliant theologians, who are kind of second-rate theologians. I mean, I think we're in kind of a massive reappraisal of that, and it's proceeding apace. So that's one important thing, that there's still lots of good work to be done to retrieve this full spectrum of voices from the Christian past, and maybe set ourselves up, maybe not for an immediate solution in the 21st century, but if we're here in the 22nd century, maybe that will be helpful in Christianity's self-conception.
David, we have no more formal questions, but if Amy or Alexis wanted to make any final comments or wrap up our conversation, we're at the end now. So I mean, this was a great note on which to end, David. So I think this has come to a nice final
Thank you.
resolution.
Can I just read and second and agree with Amy's note? If I can just read it into the record here for our video friends.
Please.
It's the multiplicity that has potential political force to me, Amy writes, including the everyday sacramental experience that is a site of enormous difference. And I couldn't agree more. That was well said.
Yeah, the sacramental was from Doug Burton Christie's comment. I was piggybacking on that.
I missed
But
that.
yeah. But it's what opens everything up, which is really powerful, I think.
Rebecca,
Well,
I'll
thank
hand it
you all
back to
so
you.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here over time, and to David for the book, and Amy and Alexis for their comments. And Arjun, you did a brilliant job as moderator. So I think kudos to everyone all around. And enjoy the rest of your day. We have so much left to think about here.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks, David.